just like I have a lot of respect, as you should too, for Dr. Richard Pan, State Senator Richard Pan, who has joined us every Friday. The man's schedule is, I'm sure, absolutely insane, but he takes 20 minutes out of his day each and every Friday to come on, and based on your feedback, and I had a feeling it would be this way, to help assure so many of you answer questions and make people feel a lot more educated and a lot more calm. He joins us right now. Dr. Pan, it's Dave. Good morning. How are you, sir?
Hi. Doing well. How are you?
Just watching, I think like a lot of people, watching our economies slowly reopen, and I am really happy for restaurants and businesses and people's mental health being able to go out and do things, but I am also scared to death, and I know that that's not a popular thing to say because it's not manly, it's not, it's not adult, it's not mature, but I'm not going to lie. I am super worried, and Doc, I hope a combination of people doing the right things and hopefully a combination of the virus getting tired or something is going to help us avoid a second breakout.
Well, I just should say, first of all, it's certainly adult and mature to look the facts in their face, and I think it's manly as well. So right. I think when you don't look at the facts in their face, that's what children do, and that's why we have adults to help them. Right. I would say is that we're continuing to do well, but the number of people who are in the hospital and the number of cases have sort of flattened out, and we are coming into a holiday weekend. So I know there's perhaps many people who are looking to go out, maybe even travel a little bit, and I just want to remind people that the virus is still out there. Going outside is fine, but try to stay 6 feet away from people. Wearing a mask helps prevent the spread of the disease. It doesn't necessarily protect the person who wears it, but the people around them. But if we all do it, we protect each other, right? Being sure you wash your hands frequently. All those things we talked about earlier on still applies. And because people have been doing this, we are able to slowly lift some of the restrictions. So today, actually, the order from the Sacramento County will allow more places to open for the weekend, and I think that we'll have to monitor it carefully. But given the fact that we've been able to slow the spread of this virus, if people continue to be cautious, and it's good to be a little nervous about this, so that you do the right things, then we can try to do this safely. Now, I should point out though is that if the virus does start spreading more quickly, there's usually a lag of 2 to 3 weeks before we start seeing the impact of that. So if it starts spreading more quickly this weekend because people are less cautious, we'll see the impact 2 or 3 weeks later. That's when you start seeing something change. And that's why we want to do things slowly to be sure that we don't have that change in terms of the spread of the virus later on.
Dr. Pan, we see, for example, in Alabama right now is becoming another hot spot. But then at the same time, the governor of Florida was very aggressive this week, saying, hey, we've been open XYZ weeks, and look at our numbers and how low they are and what people predicted and how stupid they thought we were. Can we look at a state like Florida or Georgia or maybe some of these other states that have opened and have not seen those spikes in 3 and 4 weeks? Can we look at that, and can we take solace from that, or is it still too early in your opinion?
I think it's a little tricky because depending on how much testing they have, it depends on what they pick up. The other thing I would also keep in mind is that whatever the governor or someone else says, it really is about the behavior of the people who are in the state or in different communities. And actually polling shows a vast majority of Americans, usually 70+% of Americans, are concerned enough that they say that they themselves would not go out and shop and so forth. And so even in places where they've lifted some of these orders, for example, certain places in, as I mentioned, Georgia, Florida, et cetera, a lot of things are still closed down, or people aren't going out. And that's why I try to remind people about the economy itself, is that the virus itself and fear of the virus is something that will continue to limit economic activity, and that that fear is realistic. And that's why it's so important that we continue to work toward increasing the testing so that we can test all the people who need to be tested. We need to identify people who are positive, and then we need to be able to contact trace to find out who they've been in contact so we can identify other people who may have the disease, so we get moved to what's called a containment strategy, where we have a good idea of who has the infection, who doesn't. And right now we are in the state of California. We're training a lot of contact tracers to do that work. We, of course, have been continuing to ramp up the testing. And then when we identify people who are positive, we have to figure out how to isolate them as well. So if they happen to live home alone, that's straightforward. If they don't, or they're homeless or so forth, we have to find a place to isolate them for 2 weeks or so, the period of time we need to be sure that they are no longer infectious. And
of course, people. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Doc. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. So basically, that's when we can assure people that we actually have control over this outbreak, and that people can feel more confident to go out and do more things. And that is something that is going to be very important, that we can assure people that when they go out and shop, or when the kids finally can go back to school and all these other things, that people are safe.
One of my favorite things about bringing Dr. Pan on are your questions, which we try to get across throughout the interview. You can text us in at 441140 if you want to sneak one in. Here's one I got just before you came on, Doc. Dave, would you please ask Dr. Pan about mRNA vaccines? I don't know much about it yet, but from my understanding, that's what Moderna and some others are working on. What makes it function differently than a, quote, typical vaccine, and has one been used on a mass scale before? So a lot of questions there, but obviously you would know better than anyone.
So there's a lot of work on vaccines. As I've mentioned before, we're unlikely to get a vaccine that is proven to be that's gone through basically all these safety and efficacy studies in less than 18 months, and that's only if everything goes perfectly right. We do have vaccines against RNA viruses already, so those already exist. One mRNA vaccine does is it targets the RNA. So RNA is a type of genetic material. So most people are perhaps more familiar with DNA. That's what we call the code of life. That's kind of like the master blueprint. The RNA is basically a copy of that master blueprint for a particular protein. And so what they're targeting is they're targeting the RNA that's in the virus that helps it replicate. And in fact, many of the tests that we do pick up the RNA to show that the virus actually is in the body or not. So when you get that nasal swab, they're basically looking at the RNA that's in the virus. And so by targeting it, you hope you can kill the virus. And one of the things I do want to be cautious about, so for example, you saw a lot of news about this vaccine, Moderna, that had some promising results. That was phase 1, promising results on, I think, 8 people. So it's still a long, long way before we can say this vaccine really works, and that we've tested enough people to assure that of its safety. And so the initial results are good. It means that the first small group of people didn't have any problems with it, and seemed to be seem to have some efficacy, but that's a long way from saying that this is the vaccine that's going to help protect us all from this virus.
Doc, I ask you this question almost every week, and I purposely ask you because I know things can change, and I know your background and how hard you have worked to educate people on safe vaccination, to literally write laws to help protect kids and protect our society and really dispel a lot of that misinformation out there. I will keep asking because I'm perpetually curious, as somebody who has spent so much of his life defending and educating on vaccines. And maybe this outcome will depend on our November election, I don't know. But do you, again, do you in the back of your head worry, let's say the Moderna thing goes through and now we're sitting here in October and it's been thousands and it's still had the great results, and normally you'd have that trial for side effects and all that. But as the news seems to leak out, people get excited, and I imagine there will be tremendous pressure to speed up those trials, pressure on the FDA from up above, et cetera, et cetera. Do you worry that we may get a vaccine out there to the populace that has not gone through what would normally be the trials and tests that any other vaccine would get, to the potential detriment of the things you're trying to do in making sure vaccines are as safe as can be?
Well, I would say that while there may be some concerns about this, and you're right, there could be both tremendous political pressure to release a vaccine early, as well as political pressure to not vaccinate. That's because of the disinformation that's been put out. I think that the scientists are going to demand that we do the studies that are necessary to be sure that the vaccine is both efficacious, meaning it works, and that it's safe. And I think the public will want that as well. So certainly there will be pressure to do so, but I'm cautiously optimistic that that in the end the vaccine will need to go through and will go through the necessary safety and efficacy trials necessary to assure that it will work before it is distributed. I will point out that distributing a vaccine to the general population itself has its own logistical issues, and there, people have reported about it's not only producing the vaccine in sufficient quantities to get it out into the general population, it's also everything to producing the little vials that they come in as well.
Right.
So even that, once we identified a vaccine or two that are particularly promising, but also now have gone through all those trials and have been approved for use in the general public, we're still going to have to work pretty hard to get it to everybody. I think we've already seen logistical issues in this country around protective equipment, around testing, around other things. We'll perhaps have this, hopefully we won't run into the same problems, but we'll have similar challenges when it comes to distributing a vaccine once one is approved. But you're right. I mean, we need to be sure that we continue to demand that any vaccine, before it is approved, that it shows safety and efficacy, just like every other vaccine that is already approved.
So, last part of that question then, and what's one of the things that's so wonderful in talking to you is not just your medical background, your vaccination background, but you're also a legislator. So I'm going to talk to the state senator, Richard Pan, here for a second. Could you see a situation where, if you were the guy in charge nationally of it, if you were the one deciding whether or not to pull the trigger, could you see a situation where you would be okay with fast-tracking a vaccine, and would part of that decision be helped by, and I'll use hydroxychloroquine for an example, but please don't stick to that, a medicine that has already been used, a medicine that has already gone through trials, and that is being repurposed towards COVID-19. Is that something that, in a dream scenario, if that were isolated and found to be effective, would that help in fast-tracking a vaccine?
Well, in terms of a vaccine for COVID-19, the vaccine is specific to a particular type of virus. So we're probably not going to be repurposing another vaccine for COVID-19. Now, I will tell you that some people have indicated that they thought that the tuberculosis vaccine, interestingly enough, a vaccine that's not used in the United States. So I like to say that I'm not pro-vaccine, I'm pro-science. And so there are vaccines out there we don't routinely use in the United States because it's not. We don't think that's particularly efficacious given the population in the United States and the prevalence of that disease. So, for example, there's a tuberculosis vaccine, sometimes referred to as BCG, that's used in other parts of the world. And some people have said, well, it seems to have a potentially protective effect against COVID-19. Some people have looked at countries that use that vaccine and said that, well, our COVID rates aren't as high in those particular countries, and that's being investigated. But we're still not recommending that people get this TB vaccine here in the United States, because until we can show for sure that it works, then we don't want to be using it yet. And I think that applies to not only vaccines but any other treatment. And I think we've talked about this before on this radio show, and people ask about treatments. I said the most important thing is that is to have people enter trials if they're ill, to be sure that whatever treatment we use, because unfortunately we haven't identified a successful treatment for this virus, should be done through clinical trials so that we can, as quickly as possible, get to the point where we understand what works and what doesn't work, because we don't know what works and what doesn't work. Certainly there are some things that are promising, right? So there's the studies of remdesivir, which seems to show it may decrease the length of hospitalization. So if you actually have the COVID and you're in the hospital, it looks like it may decrease your time in the hospital, but it's not going to cure you of the disease at this point. People also looked at using the serum from people who've recovered from COVID as a treatment, and that seems to show some promise as well. And again, people are still continuing to do studies to see how effective that may be. So that and remdesivir. Hydrochloroquine, as you mentioned, has been going various trials, and the more recent ones don't seem to be particularly promising for that. And in fact, it may show that this treatment is actually more dangerous than helpful. But again, people are still doing trials to figure that out, and that's how we advance our knowledge. And so it is a scary time. It'd be great if I could say, well, guess what? If you get infected with the coronavirus and you have COVID-19, here's the treatment for it. Right now, we don't have one, and in order to figure one out, we have to have people enter trials so we can actually assess how effective any particular treatment is, and that's how we're going to get to a treatment faster, is if people are willing to participate in these trials.
Doc, we are completely out of time, but I got to sneak this in. I'm going to ask you the same question Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx have both been asked, and many other doctors. My NASA scientist cousin Gabrielle is fond of saying science doesn't care about your beliefs. It doesn't care about your emotions. So I'm just going to ask you point blank. What is your confidence level that we will eventually get a vaccine for COVID-19?
Well, I think that there are a lot of promising signs for getting a vaccine, but developing a vaccine is certainly not always certain. And so, for example, HIV is a virus that's been around for a long time. We've been working on a vaccine for that. We currently don't have a vaccine. Now, that's a virus that tends to mutate frequently, and so it tends to change a lot. It's hard to get to. The coronavirus for COVID-19 doesn't seem to change in that way, so I think people are more optimistic that we're able to get a vaccine. The other issue is, are people immune after they get infected? And that's been a question mark. I think some of the more recent data seems to indicate that people probably are immune after they get the disease. That's part of the reason why using serum from people who have recovered has continued to be promising as well. We still need to gather more data, but if that's the case, then that makes it more likely we're going to be able to develop a vaccine that will give people longer-lasting immunity. So those are all positive signs for a vaccine, but we still have a long way to go before we can certainly say that whether we're going to have a vaccine for this disease. But there's a lot of people working on it. There's a lot of different candidates that are being worked on as well. So most of them will fail, but hopefully one or two will prove to be effective, and we'll have something we can protect ourselves with.
On behalf of all of our listeners, we cannot tell you how much we appreciate you coming on and giving us some education and a little bit of peace of mind each and every Friday. Dr. Pan also has his own podcast, and as I do every Friday, I will put that out on social media. Make sure you listen, learn, get educated, and do the right thing. Dr. Pan, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next week.
Okay, thank you, and everyone have a great Memorial Day weekend. Stay safe.